I'm going to take a liberty here and do a little sidebar, apart from manhood and womanhood stuff. We often, especially in our Restoration Church of Christness roots, glorify house churches as the ultimate form of church because that's the way they did it in the first century. We see that at least here. And we think that that's the real way to be biblical. Let me say what I'm going to say, and I think you'll agree. But I find that to be a difficult conclusion to come to for a lot of reasons. And here's the conclusion is house churches are not worse than building churches, whatever you want to call it, but they're also not better than building churches. There's no qualitative difference between the two. So often there'll be kind of just groups of people that will say, we really should be doing house churches. I think it's right to push back against that because the only evidence for that is that's what they were doing, at least in part of their body. Why did they not have a public meeting place? Was it because it was better not to? Or there really weren't public buildings like that? I mean, people worked at home. You didn't really go to an office. There weren't just buildings everywhere for various reasons. Additionally, the financial issues would have been a problem for the early church. Maybe the most obvious reason is the persecution of the church, where they were hiding out and drawing the ichthys fish on the outside dirt so they know they were there. And if they would have had a public building that said Christians on it, it probably wouldn't have lasted very long, all those reasons. But it's hard for me to imagine, there's no biblical reason to imagine that if persecution wasn't a problem and someone come up to Lydia or them and said, hey, here's a building for you guys to meet in that can be for the church, can be for the gathered body, can be for whatever you like it to be, you can use it. It's hard for me to imagine them saying, no, house churches are better. That's more faithful. It was just, that's what made sense at the time, that's what they did at the time for those kind of reasons, not because it was the more faithful way, right? They didn't have buildings, they didn't have air conditioning, they didn't have seats, they didn't have screens, they didn't have Bibles, but it's not right to conclude that since they didn't have those things that we shouldn't have those things, right? So I think our restoration, which is a good thing, we often go too far and we say we should be doing it the way they're doing it. There's just a lot of things that there's no reason to feel that way and to think that way about those things. We can't conclude that their lack of something means that that's a better way of doing it. It just means they lacked it. And one of those is a place to gather. One of the things I've mentioned before, a biblical principle, is that description does not necessarily equal prescription, which means just because the Bible describes something doesn't mean that it's telling you that's how it should be. A good example of that is in the Old Testament. We have polygamy throughout the Old Testament, where these people have multiple wives. And just because the Bible is describing a time where they had multiple wives doesn't mean God is saying multiple wives. Description does not equal prescription. And describing them meeting in house churches is not God saying that's how it's supposed to be. It may be in some cases, but it's not necessarily. Let me give you one interesting verse. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Verse 17 to start. In the following instructions, I do not commend you because when you come together, it is not for the better, but for the worse. When you assemble, it's not. Okay, now look down at verse 22. What? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What should I say to you? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in? So it seems like there was somewhere besides the house that they were leaving their homes and going to a place and gathering. It may have been somebody else's house, but it doesn't. I mean, it may have been. We don't know. But we know people were leaving their homes and going somewhere. And so the idea that a house church is greater than, depending on which direction, is greater than building churches is it's no better than to say that a AC-less, air conditioning-less church is better than an air-conditioned church. It's the same line of thinking. And so house churches are good. They're great. But they're not better than or higher than or more valuable biblically than what we are doing here. There's certainly nothing wrong with meeting in houses and churches meeting in houses as long as that house church has the things the Bible prescribes, has elders and deacons and sing and open the word to preach and take communion and other things churches do. All I'm saying is there's no meaningful difference in house churches and building churches. The church is a people, not a place, and so the place is relatively insignificant. The gathering of people, the location of the gathering is relatively insignificant in both directions. Okay,